fascinating spot Texas Longhorns are in right now, as it was just announced last Thursday that Will Muschamp is going to be Texas' new defensive coordinator. And who would have thought in 2025 that we would be having this conversation, right? And it's one of those things where I'm excited to see how this turns out, right? Because going into the season, there were such high expectations for Texas being number one ranked in the country. You had the preseason hype of Arch Manning. You had a number of guys return, both on the offensive side and the defensive side. You had CJ Baxter. You have Widener, who just said he was giving the transfer portal, along with a bunch of other running backs. And it just felt like a team that was ready to kind of take that next step, or at the very least, compete for the SEC championship and be in the college football playoff. But fast forward to what we saw now, and they didn't make the playoff, and that was by and large due to them, coming up short versus a Florida team that really had absolutely nothing to lose at that point in time. Even though they do deserve credit for being Texas A&M, so they do get some brownie points for that. But fast forward to now, and Will Muschamp is the new defense coordinator at Texas. And, for those of you who don't know, Will Muschamp was the head coach in waiting back in, 2008, 2009 when Mac Brown was there. Originally, the idea was Mac Brown was going to hand over the reins to Will Muschamp. And then in 2010, Will Muschamp took the Florida job, and here we are now. And he also, not to mention too, after the Florida job, he also, had a stint at South Carolina for a couple seasons too. And then he's been an analyst at Georgia for the past couple seasons. And I think all things considered, this just seems like the right moment for Will Muschamp to kind of take the reins and take a shot at coming back to Texas, right? Him and Steve Sarkisian have always had a great relationship. Obviously, Texas has a special place in Muschamp's heart, just considering how a lot of the beginning of his career was predicated around being around Mac Brown and, coaching some great Longhorn players. And, I say this as, people who watch this program know that I'm a Florida guy. I love my Gators, but I have to objectively say that it's one of those moments I really do feel happy for Will Muschamp. I always admire coaches that say, "Hey, I'm going to pick my family over a head coaching job or over a coordinator job." And for a couple years, he was able to see his kids be in high school, be able to play football. And now that they're in college doing their thing, now kind of seems like the best time for Muschamp to kind of take that next step too. Because even a couple weeks ago, if you would have told me that Will Muschamp would have taken any defensive coordinator job, yet alone the Texas job, you definitely would have fooled me, because I certainly didn't have any sort of intel or any sort of read on this. So for him to be kind of in this situation, I'm really excited for them. And I guess what this means for Texas football more than anything is they are all in on winning a national championship this year. They have decided that they are going all in no matter what their hand is. And it just feels like one of those moments where, again, this is just me speculating here, but I think the Texas administration is putting a lot of pressure on Steve Sarkisian to win a national title next season. And now in this age of college football, we live in a world where the expectation for about 20 teams every year is winning the national championship, when in reality, that's just simply not viable. You know what I mean? And when you only have 12 teams in the college football playoff, maybe 16 or maybe 18, depending on what the next iteration of the college football playoff may be, there is a sort of scale that you have to kind of say to yourself, there's going to be a handful of teams that just simply have unrealistic expectations. But nevertheless, here we are now. And, it's going to be good for Texas in a sense, right? Because, it's tough because, Kwiatkowski, he didn't really do anything wrong necessarily per se, right? Because, when you kind of look at some of the stats that they've had, they've been, top 15 in terms of defense for the most part there. And I guess another thing to add too is the reason why we have these expectations to begin with is because Texas is the first preseason number one to fall out of the top 10 since back in 2012, the 2012 USC Trojans team. So I guess there is a little bit of a flair there in terms of why there's so much pressure. But I think the common criticism that I've seen that I think you can potentially argue about this is I think a lot of Texas fans felt that sometimes that Kwiatkowski wasn't aggressive enough in certain moments. There was probably at least reading between the lines when I was listening to Sarkisian's press conference in terms of talking about the Will Muschamp hire. He sort of hinted at that in order for me to win a national championship at Texas, I have to spend more time coaching the offense. And that leads to a fascinating question, right? Is Steve Sarkisian spending more time with the offense really what the issue with Texas is? I I don't know if I entirely agree with that. Because if you think about this, right, let's just kind of look at where Texas is at right now. About Texas right now, at least offensively speaking, is every year that Sarkisian has been with Texas, their offense has not been ranked in the top 15. And I think that's definitely worth mentioning too, especially when they've had guys like Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning and some pretty elite quarterbacks that have gone to Texas, and you're kind of in that same sort of spot too. And another thing I'd like to mention too that I think really kind of gets overlooked here is if you're Texas, your biggest question this offseason is going to be what do you do at running back? Your top four running backs are all going to be in the transfer portal. And now you're going to be tasked with having no choice but to get an elite guy coming in the transfer portal. Now, what we're kind of speculating here is that Texas hired Florida's running back coach, and they think that they can get Jaden Bahr to come over to Texas. Which, if he ends up coming to Texas, then that solves all your problems because Jaden Bahr is a guy that I've said on my channel multiple times that he is the type of guy that you can build an entire offense around. And most importantly, what you need in terms of a number one running back for Texas, you really need a guy to take the pressure off Arch Manning as much as you possibly can. Because I think what we kind of learned about Arch Manning is even though I truly believe he has the intangibles, he has a great arm, he says the right things, and he does have some really good mechanics, and he does have a better arm than people think, and he is more athletic than people think. However, is Arch Manning the guy that's necessarily going to take over games? And I don't necessarily think we saw a lot of signs of that this year, especially if we go back and look at the beginning of the season where they played Ohio State, for example. We saw glimpses of him struggling. If we go a little bit towards the middle of the season, I would argue that Kentucky game, which by the way, they should have lost that Kentucky game as well. If you go back to that game, you know, Arch Manning kind of struggled a little bit there. So I think what Manning is going to be struggling with moving forward is can he take that next step versus elite defenses, which he's only going to continue to see within the SEC. And, I think too, it just kind of speaks to how aggressive Texas is going to be, right? Because one thing that you can say about any defensive coached Will Muschamp team is that they are going to be aggressive. They are going to be swarming all over the field. They are going to be pressuring you nonstop, and that's part of what makes Will Muschamp's defenses really special, and that's part of what has made him successful for a number of years. He understands what it's like to coach in the SEC. He has the charisma to be able to connect with recruits, and most importantly, the guy's a winner, and he's a relatively an eccentric guy too. So I'm fascinated to kind of see how that pairing works between Sarkisian and Muschamp goes because we all know this is Sarkisian's offense, and we all know he's calling the plays, and it's going to get to a point now where we can kind of maybe sit there and say that maybe Sark and Kwiatkowski maybe had some philosophical differences between what coverages they want to run or how aggressive they should be in certain moments. But the reality that we have right now is, you know, Texas is simply not where they're supposed to, not where they're supposed to be, and not where they want to be. Because, like I said before, they were returning a bunch of SEC starters this season. They gave up 29 points on the road versus the Gators. They allowed 30 or more points in four of their last 5 games. And, you know, when Texas finished number 3 in scoring defense in the FBS in 2024 to where they've been right now, it's just not acceptable for where they're at. However, there is some silver lining to this, right? Like I said before, they hired Florida's running back coach, DeBoer Jaluk, and you got to be pretty excited about Texas's 2026 recruiting class here. According to On3 Sports, which, on this program I always end up using, they are, 10th recruiting class in the country. Obviously that's a little bit of a step back compared to being first, but like I said on this channel before, you can never always be first at everything. 52% of their class is in state, which for me, I think that's an excellent number, all things considered, with how much competition you have within the state, not to mention Oklahoma, LSU, Arizona, and all those surrounding states as well. And a couple guys to look after too. Diabell, an elite 5-star kid who will probably have a chance at being the starting quarterback after Arch Manning leaves if he sticks around that long. You have Derek Cooper, who is really kind of a flashy running back, someone who's got really quick footwork, someone who's got some speed, and someone who can break some tackles. And then you have some other dynamic playmakers such as Jermaine Bishop, and then on the defensive line, you got James Johnson and Jamarian Carlton. So it's not only that they're getting these elite guys as well, but they're also getting a group that's loaded with top 100 prospects such as Tyler Atkinson and such as Richard Wesley. So for a total of 23 commits, I think that's something that you have to be excited about for Texas. And like I said before, they have to continue to be aggressive in terms of getting players in that running back room, because when you only manage just shy of 4 yards a carry, it's just simply not sustainable. And they're going to have to dip into the transfer portal in order to figure that out. But to kind of wrap up this segment, what hiring Will Muschamp says to me is that they're all in on winning right now. They're all in on winning a national championship. I think the administration is giving Sark a lot of pressure for them to make this happen right now. But overall, I think if you're Texas, I think at the very least, Muschamp's going to help you on the recruiting trail. I think the fact that he's already been successful here before, I think he probably has a hunger and an enthusiasm that I think is going to be unleashed, given that he really hasn't been on the sidelines for a pretty long time in a coordinator role since 2015. And I'm really excited to see that happen. And I'm really happy for Will Muschamp to be back on the sideline again, be back in the SEC and coaching some defense. Because, I think if anybody kind of deserves this come around again moment, it's a guy like Will Muschamp who had his time to shine to Florida and South Carolina. And, let's see what he can do at Texas with some of the best resources in the entire country.